This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
LifeLock, how can I help?
The IRS said I filed my return,
But I haven't.
1 in 4 tax-paying Americans has paid the price of identity fraud.
What do I do?
My refund, though.
I'm freaking out.
Don't worry, I can fix this.
LifeLock fixes identity theft guaranteed and gets your money back with up to $3 million in coverage.
I'm so relieved.
No problem. I'll be with you every step of the way.
1 in 4 was a fraud-paying American. Not anymore. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. Although not for very much longer, I am handing over the reins of Spy Masters to the brilliant Paul Burke. He's the head honcho at Aspects of Crime. And if there is nothing Paul doesn't know about spy writing, he's writing an encyclopedia of spy fiction, for goodness sake. So he really knows this stuff. So carry on listening to Spy Masters. And if you want to hear more from me, I'm over on the History Book Buffs, a podcast I do jointly with the brilliant historian Audrey Morehouse. And we do book reviews, author interviews, fact and fiction. Find us on YouTube, History Book Buffs, or just search wherever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, this is my last ever Spy Masters interview, I think, with James Wolff, the brilliant writer behind Spies and Other Gods. James was in the British Intelligence Service for 15 years, and he has brought all his experience and all his knowledge to bear on what is a groundbreaking, brilliant, funny, experimental novel. And I'm absolutely delighted to be talking to James Wolff. So don't forget, give Paul Burke all the love. Follow me on History Book Buffs and listen on now for me talking to James Wolff, not his real name for reasons that will become obvious, on his new novel, Spies and Other Gods. James Wolff, thank you so much for coming on the Spy Masters podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're here today to talk about your new novel, Spies and Other Gods. Now, this is the first of yours that I've read, and I'm so glad that I did because I completely adored it. Congratulations on it.
Thank you.
It's quite different in style, but perhaps similar in tone to other books I've read. So there's quite a lot for us to unpick. But before we start, can we hear a little bit about you? Because obviously, I don't know what you can tell us, but you have a background in intelligence. So can you tell us, as much as you can about how informed you are on this particular topic?
Yes, well, I worked in British intelligence for around 15 years, doing a variety of different roles, mostly in the UK, but traveling a lot within that. And I can't really say a huge amount more than that, which is probably frustrating for both of us. But you leave the profession with a whole set of restrictions and prohibitions weighing very heavily on your shoulders. And if you're doing what I'm doing, which is writing spy novels as a former spy, then you have to submit your books to the censor, and they go through it with a red pen, crossing stuff out. And they're very keen to remind me of my obligations at every stage. So they don't want me to name an organization. They don't want me to talk about any of the things I might have worked on and the countries I might have traveled to or any of that. So I'm afraid it has to be a kind of fairly bland CV, but there it is.
It's a big contrast because I've interviewed quite a few CIA operatives turned novelists, and they seem to have so much more freedom than the British ones. It seems insane to me. I mean, it's not like we don't know that these organizations exist and whatever in the world. So why do you think the CIA gets to be more relaxed than British intelligence about people in your position?
I think there's a very particular British attitude to secrecy that is not really replicated in any other country around the world. I mean, I share your surprise and I share your confusion as well. Americans, CIA officers, seem to me to be able to be astonishingly frank about what they've done and where they've served and the kind of things they did in the countries in which they served. And then in contrast, in the UK, we're told not to say anything at all. Exactly as you say, as though there's still some public doubt as to whether MI5, MI6, and GCHQ really exist. In the redaction process or the censoring process for one of my books, I mentioned just in passing that GCHQ is located in Cheltenham. And I got a note back from the censor saying, please remove the reference to the physical location of GCHQ.
No.
Yes, I know. And I said, hang on, there are street signs in Cheltenham that point the way to GCHQ. GCHQ's website tells you where there are. I mean, Google, it couldn't be more of a kind of publicly known building. And they said, yes, well, we grant that. But at the same time, we sort of don't want to give undue prominence to the physical location of the buildings, which gives you some insight into just how, I'm going to use the word irrational, how kind of irrational our approach to these things is. I mean, I think there's a bit in Spies and Other Gods where the narrator refers to the secret world as a bubble and says something like, it's either a bubble or it's not. There's no halfway house. And I think that feeds in to their attitude on these things, that you just have to, as best you can, be completely secret and discuss nothing. But I think that's increasingly untenable in the modern world, where people are crying out for openness and a bit more transparency, and where these agencies are trying to be their own PR agencies as well. I mean, they have social media accounts. GCHQ publishes a puzzle book every year. During the pandemic, MI5 was, the building was lit up in blue for NHS workers. So it's a very odd situation where they're trying to reclaim their public reputation, but also trying to keep everything secret.
Perhaps they've decided that spy novels are not the best place to reclaim their reputation, because often their reputation isn't particularly enhanced by them. So let's talk specifically about the book, James. Spies and Other Gods, for the benefit of those unfortunate souls out there who haven't read it. Could you just give us a brief overview of the book?
Yes, so the germ of the novel was something that happened in the real world. There's a body of politicians who oversee the work of the three spy agencies, and it's a committee called the ISC, the Intelligence and Security Committee. And every year they publish a report, which is heavily redacted, but they publish a report which anyone can look at, which really goes into, the conversations they've had with the spies and their kind of reflections on what's been done well and what hasn't. And I'm slightly obsessed with these reports because they're one of the very few public documents that really make reference to what's going on in the real world. And in a report of theirs from 2019, I think it was, they make reference to the fact that the committee have been saying to the spies, you need to give us access to your officers, to your staff. If your staff want to make a complaint, then they should be allowed to make that complaint directly to us. And you are blocking that. And it was, in these acres of very bland government speak, which doesn't reveal very much, it was this little spurt of irritation and impatience. And it started me thinking, well, what if that embargo was lifted? What would complaint number one look like? And then from then on, it was a kind of imaginary, a process of imagining. And I came up with the idea of an Iranian assassin and a trail of dead bodies across Europe and a complaint from someone within the organization, an anonymous complaint about that way that operation was being handled.
So there is this anonymous complaint, and then a member of the committee who's a kind of former GP who's trying to do his best to oversee an intelligence agency that has no interest in being overseen, sends in a parliamentary researcher called Afra McQueen to have a look at the handling of what is effectively an open case, which is involved in the assassination attempts. Now, Afra McQueen is an extraordinary character. Afra, I'm assuming, is a nod to Afra Ben, is she, or is it coincidental?
No, kind of. Yes, I mean, I think she. I think she did some spying, didn't she, for Charles II or something like that. But it's really, I mean, it's just a name. I'm always on the lookout for distinctive names, and that it's a distinctive name. So yes, I suppose it is a kind of slight nod to the historical character.
So Afra comes in, and I think we should talk quite early in our conversation about the narration of this book. It's absolutely extraordinarily wonderful. I loved it. So who's the narrator?
Well, good question. Who is the narrator? Well, I mean, to take one step back, I suppose this happened towards the end of my career, but I started to feel, and this may be true of every large organization, but I am sort of speaking about the large organization that I was part of. But I started to get the sense that the organization itself is a character or has a character. And time again, and I don't exclude myself from this, but time and time again, I would see people making a decision based not on what they thought was right or they thought was the moral thing to do, but based on some sense of what the organization wants me to do, what I'm supposed to do in this role. And then once you do the thing, you feel like you're not really responsible for it because I was just doing my job and and so on and so forth. And I became slightly obsessed with this idea that large organizations have a character, that they have a personality, that they have quirks, that they have eccentricities. And I started to think that that would be an interesting way to tell a story of this kind. That the narrator is, I mean, I don't really know how to, the spirit of spying, the soul of the community, the kind of collective voice of the spy agency. But I was very keen to make that voice sound as human as possible. It's not meant to sound, all knowing or all powerful. It's meant to sound quite cynical, quite jaded, quite defensive. It's those organizations, because they're so closed and because they have such long histories and because they have such interesting work to do on a daily basis and such pressures upon them from outside, the characters of those organizations are really distinctive, quite gnarly. Not necessarily characters that you'd want to spend a ton of time with, but I thought there's a voice here. There's a voice here that I think would be a really engaging way to tell a story. And I would add as well, I did feel in the writing of it that this was a more honest way, for me at least, to tell the story. I mean, I think if you tell a story that involves a large organization going about its work and you don't pay some attention to the collective identity, then you are potentially missing out on a really important part of what happened and why it happened.
I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And I think for anybody who worries that it sounds a bit too meta, don't worry about that at all, because it just works brilliantly, because this voice is very funny, kind of sly, kind of, just uniquely insightful about, as you say, an entire culture. And I think if you're interested in intelligence, I think it's absolutely fascinating. Seeing that organisation kind of personified, I think, works rather brilliantly. It reminds me, in purely literary terms, John McGregor did some similar things using a kind of and there was a novel by an American novelist ages ago that really resonated, that did a similar thing with like an insurance office or something. His name was Joshua Ferris, and the whole thing was, the whole narrative was from the we perspective of the collective people within the organisation, which is slightly different from what you're doing. I thought it was incredibly good and brave, because I think it can go badly wrong trying to do something like that. Did you feel trepidatious before you did?
Yes, I felt it was a real tightrope walk. I mean, the other book I'd add into that, Martin Amis wrote a wonderful book called Time's Arrow, which is about, it's about a Nazi war criminal, and it's about the Holocaust. But the novel, I mean, has two unusual things about it. One is that it's told backwards, and the second is that it's told by the soul of this Nazi war criminal, which is something quite distinct from the body and the brain of the Nazi war criminals. I read that and liked that very much, and it felt like an interesting way of telling it. And that, of course, was even more of a tightrope walk for Martin Amis, because, it was backwards as well. But I feel I'm sort of increasingly coming to the view that, and this really expresses my intention rather than a sense that I've achieved it. But, I think the world of spying is so complex and so uncertain and so vague and so open-ended, so inconclusive in reality, that I feel compelled to try to find new ways to tell those stories. I mean, we often use the term police procedural to talk about a kind of a detective novel. And, the police are going through very clear and very defined steps to collect evidence that they are then going to present in a court of law to try and get someone locked up. The spies have no such obligation on them. And a lot of what spies do is kind of mind-bafflingly like, what are we doing? Like, why are we doing this? Why are we worried about it? And, I think I say in the book somewhere that you can open an intelligence file rather, if you go down to the archives and pick one out. And you can really read through it and think you're reading, Finnegan's Wake or Ulysses, and you're thinking like, what is this about? Why has this file been started? What are we trying to do? Are we making any impact? What does failure look like? What does success look like? So I think it's important to always be asking ourselves, what is the best way, the most honest way, and the kind of freshest and most exciting way to tell a story about that world? And I don't think it can always be to be sort of very ABC about it.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I mean, and one of the reasons why the genre is endlessly drawing people in and endlessly fascinating is because I guess there's so many blurred lines, so many grey areas. You're being asked to do things that in other circumstances are illegal in order to, protect a legal system effectively. So the contradiction is inherent from the very establishment of the service in the first place. So you're right, finding new ways to sort of get into that it's also difficult to find new ways to get into it because it's quite a rich heritage. I mean, did you feel the weight of trying to do something new when actually, it would have been easier to do something hackneyed?
I did feel that tension. I increasingly was just finding it very difficult to write in a more kind of conventional way. I would try, when I did try to do it, I felt kind of uncomfortable with the process and that I was being a little bit dishonest. And I think I just have something in my, what writerly DNA I have that just makes me want to kind of explore a little bit and maybe test some of the boundaries and see if there are new ways of doing these things. I mean, just coming back to the sort of earlier point, about the kind of reality of spying. I remember when I was fairly sort of early on in my career and, involved in operations. And I remember one particular occasion when I was going out to speak to someone and I was having a chat with my manager beforehand. And I was very keen to get some kind of like, right, what am I doing? What exactly am I trying to find out? What are the parameters? What can I say? What can't I say? What are the next steps? What does this look like? And my manager, who was a kind of, experienced old ham, was just like, well, who knows? Just go and have a chat and see how it goes. And it doesn't reflect very well on me that I felt a sense of like, well, hang on, that's not good enough. I need to know what is the framework of this conversation I'm going to have with this person and what are the objectives? He was very much like, well, we just don't know. So just go along and have a chat and see where it goes. And I think that's something that is quite common in the spying world, a sense of like, well, we're just going to like test this door and see if it opens. And if it opens, we'll just see what's on the other side, and that will lead us to the next thing and the next thing. So I think there's that kind of, in reality, I think that's more, I suppose as well, in reality, I feel that's more exciting than the kind of ABC of storytelling, to have something that feels like the rug could be pulled out from under your feet at any moment.
You describe it actually in the novel. At one point you say it's a bit like trying to tell a story through a skein of wool, like you can't quite see what's coming. I think another way that it really works is that if you were to explore in novel form the culture of intelligence with the depth that you do in a kind of more traditional way, it would end up being very expositional and quite boring. Actually, I think it achieves it gives the novel a kind of depth of understanding, which is absolutely brilliant for those of us who are interested in this subject. What it also doesn't do then is like deaden the plot, because there is a fantastic plot, which, as you say, it feels a bit like, now you mention it, like the pushing of doors and seeing where they go. So Afra, to return, we started on Afra ages ago, but Afra basically goes in at the behest of the parliamentary committee and starts looking at the file about these assassins and starts being sort of asking questions and being awkward. And in the file, they're trying to get to this Iranian living in Paris, and they want to get through to him through his friend, who is a Birmingham dentist, right? So the Birmingham dentist appears quite early. He's got substance abuse issues. He's quite vulnerable. He's quite ready to be exploited, and sort of half knows he's being exploited and half doesn't. And so there's all these fascinating human relationships begin to develop. And the other character who comes in quite early, who I absolutely adore, is when Afra goes into the intelligence building, she's allocated a minder called Susan. Just tell us a little bit about Susan. I love Susan. Tell me she exists. People like her exist.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's so it feels like in the world of spy fiction and spy TV, there are certain roles that get all of the airtime. Whether you're the agent handler or the investigator or so on. But there are, dozens of other roles that are totally unique to the intelligence world that no one ever talks about. And one of them is the role of building escort. So if you can imagine something kind of breaks inside the building, I don't know, if there's there's a gas leak, or a wall needs painting, or the toilets are blocked or something like that, you'll often have to have tradespeople come in from outside to fix it, but they can't be allowed to roam around the building by themselves. So they are given a minder, as you say, a building escort. And a building escort, you might see them around the building with their little kind of deck chairs, so they're going to the beach or something, and their flask, and they'll sit next to the tradespeople as they're working, and they'll get out their book of crosswords and have a cup of tea and sit there and chat to the tradesperson as they're doing their job, and then make sure they don't wander around the building and steal secrets. In a way, I suppose it is the kind of most humble of all the jobs in the building. I mean, the character you're talking about originally was literally just going to be there as a person who facilitated Afra's entry into the building. She was going to meet Afra at the door, take her to the place. Afra was going to start her work, and that would have been the last we saw of Susan. But as soon as I started to write dialogue for her, I kind of thought, oh, this is quite fun. I quite like her voice. I quite like her narkiness, the way she's awkward. She's quite difficult. And it felt that she could kind of represent something within the organization from a totally different perspective that would bring something to the story. And she continued, she's there until almost the end of the book.
Yeah, she's brilliant. And you get like, a sense of her, and there's all these kind of funny exchanges where she's just talking about her grandkids or whatever, and then she kind of rolls back and she's quite narky, and she plugs into that sense of the wider culture of the environment as well. And I just thought that was really good. She also does something. I don't want to give away too much because, as you say, it's pushing open the doors. It's just like, which door do you and I stop at today? But let's just say things develop, and Afra, it turns out, is not quite who she seems either. And she knows a bit too much about the file that she's gone in to look at. She develops her own relationship with the unstable dentist, and things kind of take off a little bit. Yeah, talk us as far to the furthest door you want to take us, James.
Yes, I mean, organizations like that are very practiced, I think. This is my sense of it. They're very practiced at keeping outsiders in their place and keeping them at arm's length. And obviously, earlier on I was talking about this committee, the ISC committee in Parliament, and the fact that if you read their reports, time and time again, you get these little spurts of irritation at the way, you said you'd do this and you haven't. You said you'd give us those documents and you haven't. Comes up again and again and again. And you really get the sense in those reports of the external regulators being kept at arm's length. And so when Afra comes in, they allow her to look at the files. But at the same time, I think they are maneuvering, the organization is maneuvering in a way to make sure that she's contained, that she can't go too far, that she can't do real damage. And eventually she does come up against some kind of brick wall. The organization thinks that is the end of it, that they've successfully foiled her and that's the end of the story. But she, bounces off in an unexpected direction and reveals in the process that she knew a lot more about this than she let on at the start.
The other important character is Sir William Rentoul, who's the head of the service, who kind of embodies what you've been talking about, this kind of slick defensiveness. Tell us a bit about him, and can you, in anything you can say about how true to life he is about the heads of services, would be greatly appreciated.
Well, so he is so he's the head of the service, and I think in some ways, you say, he represents the sense of tradition and the kind of long-standing values of the service. But he is also someone who's just nearing retirement. His wife has just died, and he is suffering the very first stages, or experiencing the first stages of maybe memory loss or confusion. And it's really causing him some distress that his mental acuity has been such a strong part of his life and his career, and he feels it slipping away. And I think he feels a kind of sense of grief and panic about that. And that's in part what leads him to do something which is kind of unheard of. And I've certainly never heard of it happening in real life, which is that he kind of turns his back on the boardroom and goes into the field in some desperate attempt to try to keep hold of the sanity that he has. One last fling, one last operational burst of activity in order to try and leave the profession, I suppose, with some sense of dignity. But it doesn't quite go according to plan. Is he realistic? Well, there is another manager in the book who is the director of establishments, who's called Philip, who is a kind of, trendy vicar type, modernizer, sees himself as, always likes going around in shirt sleeves and making friends with his subordinates and that kind of thing. I would say that the Sir William Rentouls are being replaced by the Philips of this world. But there are plenty of those kind of old school traditional types still around. And I mean, I think what makes them so interesting is that they have kind of existed and operated in this very closed world for decades upon decades. And really, in some ways, when you meet them, seem to embody it. You know, they have an anecdote about every conceivable country you mention, and you know, will recommend a restaurant in the sort of back of Azerbaijan and something like that. So it's full of these interesting characters. But I think as time goes on, I think they are being slowly eased out.
I think that's dreadful. I think,
agree.
Philip.
For the purposes of novelists, it is dreadful. I agree.
In terms of, there's one other character I want to talk about, absolutely adored, which is there's an ethics counsellor, and they kind of pop in at various points of the characters to have a chat with this ethics counsellor who's got this kind of array of alphabetically arranged herbal teas, which she proffers as she kind of pronounces of whether the latest act of illegality is ethically dubious or not. And I just thought she was very funny, and I thought it was very grounding, but it was also like, I found that really fascinating. Is there such a person?
There is.
Really talk to me about this.
There really is. And again, this is something that came up during the censorship process, because I wrote the character like that, and they came back and they said, please remove all references to the ethics counsellor and replace it with staff counsellor. And I had to point out, on your own website, you boast about the fact that you've got an ethics counsellor in order to sort of, you know, show people how progressive and enlightened you are as an organization. You can't boast about it publicly on the one hand and then ask me to redact it on the other. That doesn't make any sense. But yes, the role does exist. It's a fairly new role, and it was put in place around the time that Edward Snowden fled to Hong Kong with his trove of devastating secrets. So the cynic in me would certainly say that the role is partly there to kind of capture anyone who is going through those early stage doubts about the ethics of the profession that they're involved in. And that, sorry.
Oh, I see. Like, I'm cynical. I just like, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in no way is that stated explicitly, and that might just be my opinion, but it can't be a coincidence that one of the responses to Snowden is to put this role in place. There must be some sense in which it's like, okay, we need to sort of identify who might be having doubts. I mean, during my career, I did go to the ethics counsellor at one point to have a conversation, and the person was extremely well-meaning and very nice, but the whole thing felt, well, I think objectively was totally kind of ineffectual and meaningless. And it felt a little bit like a place to go and, you know, have a nice cup of herbal tea and speak to someone who'd smile at you and nod and, yes, I totally agree. Goodness, that's terrible, isn't it? And then the door closes and no one is interested beyond that point. That might have been just my experience, but it felt intuitively to me like a kind of fig leaf of a role for something else, which is obviously something that I've kind of explored further in the book.
Can I just talk about cynicism a little bit? Because I was reading your book and I was thinking that partly because of how you've narrated it, that kind of sense of a slightly weary cynicism that you get in a lot of spy novels was quite prevalent. And I thought to myself as I was reading it, is this a kind of literary convention now, or is it an actual reflection of what it's like within spy services?
That's a good question. I don't think that. I mean, I think in terms of people who are working in that world, I think there's a kind of eye roll about HR and, you know, we don't get paid enough and, you know, people don't always like their bosses and stuff like that. So I think there's all of that stuff, which is totally par for the course. But I think on the whole, people feel probably fairly uncynical about what they're doing. I think that most people who work in that world are pretty kind of progressive, pretty kind of liberal, to be honest. I mean, there's is American Charles McCarry, that's his name, American spy novelist Charles McCarry once said he'd worked in the CIA for 15 years or so. And he said there's two types of people I never met when I was in the CIA. He said the first was an assassin and the second was a Republican, which is a fantastic line. But, you know, people who work in these organizations believe in negotiation. They believe in consensus building. They're fairly international. They often speak other languages. They travel. They have friends in other countries. So I think that people who work there tend to be fairly positive. So I don't know where the cynicism, I don't think you kind of breathe in the cynicism when you're in there. I think maybe, I don't know. I feel like my cynicism is particular to me. I don't think it's something that everyone leaves with.
No, but I think that I think it's a very rare spy novel that doesn't contain cynicism within it about the people or whatever. But maybe that's just because the nature of the plots always gives rise to cynicism, because there's always, you know, people doing bad things for good reasons. So that means that inevitably there's going to be a kind of cynical strand in most spy plots, I would have thought. No.
I think you're totally right. I mean, I think, if you look at the world of, let's say, agents, of course, you have in UK terminology, you have the officers who are the staff, and then you have the agents who are the, members of the public who are kind of co-opted or volunteer and then help by providing information. Baked into that relationship, not always, but quite often, is this degree of kind of manipulation. You don't tell your agent everything. You don't necessarily tell them what the end goal is. They don't necessarily know your real name. They don't know anything about you personally. The things you do tell them about yourself might not be true. You might make up holidays you have or relatives or children, all that kind of thing, to protect you and your identity. So I think even if you believe that the end goal of what you're trying to do, let's say prevent a terrorist attack or something like that, the end goal is unambiguously good. You just inevitably go through these kind of grubby phases to get there. And even if you agents to one side, I mean, listening in on people's conversations, it's an incredibly intrusive thing to do. And 99% of what you hear is, an argument between a husband and wife, or, siblings talking to each other, or domestic chit chat, stuff like that. So it does feel like a lot of the tools that spies use on a pretty regular basis leave a bit of a taint. They leave a bit of a stain afterwards. You don't use those tools and then come away feeling totally good about what you're doing. You just do feel a little bit grubby about it.
Yeah. James, listen, I hate to raise this, but in your novel, there is this line, and it says, anyone who chooses writing spy novels over spying itself can't have been much good in the first place. Is there something you want to tell us?
No, no, it just struck me as a good line. I mean, I hope I'm not making a comment about my own career, but I would say, I'm much more, I find the career of novelist, despite the fact I'm sitting in a room most of the time by myself with a laptop, I find the career of novelist infinitely more thrilling and exciting than the career I had as a spy, despite the fact I was in very interesting parts of the work, in very interesting places, met very interesting people. This to me is thrilling. Writing books is the thrilling part.
Well, that's lovely, and I would say that reading your book is pretty thrilling, so everybody's winning, I would say. So who are your big influences in your writing, just before because I feel like we're in a pretty good period of spy writers at the moment. Who are you influenced by, modern and ancient, as it were?
Well, I mean, confession is that I don't really read a huge amount of spy fiction, partly because I'm writing it and partly because of my former career. I just feel like it would kind of totally overwhelm me. I do, in terms of genre stuff, there's a whole load of American crime novelists who I think are absolutely fantastic. People like Elmore Leonard or Richard Price, who I think are great. I read a lot of stuff that isn't really genre fiction. But in terms of spy stuff, I mean, going back a bit, Harlot's Ghost by Norman Mailer, I think if anyone hasn't read that, I think it's quite incredible. Sort of story about a CIA officer in the 50s and 60s. And Quiet American by Graham Greene is fantastic. The Untouchable by John Banville, which is really wonderful as well. So yeah, I'd say those three in terms of spy fiction.
Do you find it difficult? So my husband's a lawyer. He can't watch courtroom dramas because he just can't bear how inaccurate they are. Do you find it difficult when you read a spy novel and you're wincing at all the flights of fancy?
A little bit, partly because of the inaccuracies, but also partly because I think, the most interesting thing about spying is two people in a room talking to each other. I think that you have all of the drama and psychology and tension and jeopardy locked in there. That's the most exciting thing. And actually, I just find that infinitely more interesting than a kind of a fist fight, which is not something that spies do, or a car chase.
Yeah, I mean, there's just one last question before I let you go, because there's like quite an absence of technology in this book, which I really liked. But is that because I feel like that's one of the tensions that modern spy novelists have, that quite a lot of the spying is done computer to computer. But I mean, that's no fun to read about, is it?
It's no fun to read. It's no fun to watch on a screen either. I mean, I guess one of the reasons I think is that technology is a particular cause for concern of the censor. And there have been occasions when I've talked about a capability that the spies have, and something super anodyne, something that your smartphone can do, Antonia. The idea that you can track a person from A to B. They'll come back and they'll be like, no, you can't give away that we can do this. And, you say, come on, everyone, they'll say, well, people might think that we do this, but they don't know that we do this, and therefore you have to remove it. So I think that's one thing. I was also never involved in the technology side, so don't know it particularly well. And as I said, I'm just drawn to the kind of human encounters and the psychology of that. But obviously technology is a huge, huge part of the profession now, and it has kind of just changed a lot, even over the last 20 years.
So you're still writing. Can we expect more like Spies and Other Gods? What's next? What's coming?
I'd like to write. Well, I am writing what I hope will be the first of a quartet of novels about a particular character or a kind of anti-hero who is a spy. So I'm just coming to the end of the first draft of that. So with a bit of luck, that might be out next year.
Brilliant. Well, we will look forward to it massively. James, thank you so much for coming on Spy Masters.
Thank you. It was great fun to talk.
Thank you so much for listening to the Spy Masters podcast. I urge you to run out and buy Spies and Other Gods. It's such a great book. And I would also urge you to go across and find me on my other platform, History Book Buffs, on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.